On November 29 of 2012, the General Assembly of the United Nations accepted the character of non-member state of Palestine by 138 votes in favor, 9 against, and 41 abstentions. The decision to request the status of an observer, as a non-member state, was taken to prevent to be presented the decision to the Security Council of the United Nations, because if they requested to be a member of the United Nations, that means that they have to go to the Security Council, and that will likely have a veto. So in this panel we want to address the topic of what does that mean, because we talk about Palestine as a state, non-member of the United Nations. What are the differences of being a member? Does it really change if they are a state but they are not really a member of the United Nations? So I'm really happy to have two really great speakers here that are experts, and we'll talk about the issue. First we have Professor Goldman. He is the Louis James Scholar, and the scholar in the WCL. He is also a faculty director of the Center of Human Rights. He has, I can name all his accomplishments, and they are really, really long. He was, in between other things, president of the commission, the Inter-American Commission, and he was the independent expert for the protections of human rights in counterterrorism. You can go online and saw his CV if you want to get depressed and see all you can do. And we will also have Mr. Nizar Farsakh, who is the General Director of the Palestine Liberation Organization, the General Delegation to the US. Mr. Farsakh, he was the Policy Director to Palestine negotiators on border issues, and has participated in both the Gaza withdrawal talks of 2005 as well as the Annapolis process of 2007 and 2008. In this last year in Ramallah, he had also been second to the office of the Palestine Prime Minister Salam Fayyad. Mr. Farsakh holds an MA in International Boundary Studies of King College of London and a Master in Public Administration from the Harvard Kennedy School. So how we will work, Professor Goldman and Mr. Farsakh, they will talk 15 minutes the most, and then we will have questions and answers. We will ask to keep the questions really short and really big questions, because we are really running out of time. And I really want this to be more interactive, so that's it.
Sure. Should I go there? Or?
What do you prefer? Because I don't think it's... No, it's too...
No, it's too short.
I'm sorry.
That's fine. Greetings everyone, thank you for having me. I don't want to take too much of your time, so I'll do my best to hit on critical points that I think are important for the discussion. I had mentioned to the organizers, I actually have an event I had to go to, a appointment I have to go to at 2:30, so I'll do my best to be short and keep the important stuff for the Q&A. So what I'm going to present today is basically a relevant background about the Palestinian UN bid, as far as the legal points are and the legal personalities are concerned. What are the UN capacities that we have and are getting, about the UN specialized agencies, the international treaties, obligations that we have, as well as the issue of representation and the issue of occupation. And finally, just quickly run through what are the implications, benefits versus the challenges that we face given this new status in the UN. So one point to begin with, as far as background, is that one of the interesting things in international law is that it has a lot of politics in it, right? So unlike, let's say, pure law, it is concerned with political issues such as stability and peace. So you often see in international law that because it is made from sovereign countries agreeing to certain rules and regulations, it has more to do with stability and peace, and less to do with pure forms or principles of justice and equity. So, for example, while the international law on treaties says that a treaty can be changed if the fundamental circumstances that made that treaty are changed in a fundamental way that changes the treaty, the one exception to that are actually boundary treaties. That is, even if the circumstances of the boundary treaty changed, no party can challenge that boundary. And the idea behind that is that in an international system, you cannot afford to have boundaries being redrawn every time the circumstances change. So in a similar fashion, the Palestinian engagement with international law as far as statehood and membership in the UN is concerned is very well, let's say, meshed with the politics of international relations. So you can't really look at it as pure law and think, oh, well, this is what the law says, and what happened is in contradiction to that law. So important milestones in our UN bid. First, as far as recognition and statehood, the first step was actually getting recognition, that the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, getting recognition by the international community that it alone represents the Palestinians. So the PLO is the legal personality in the international arena to represent Palestinians when it comes to speaking in their name in negotiations or in entering into relationships with others. So that happened in 1974, and again, it was the international community agreeing to that designation. Then in 1988, with the first Intifada, what the Palestinians managed to do is actually first we declared our statehood, our parliament in exile, the PNC, the Palestine National Council, which is the legislative body of the PLO, declared the independence of the state of Palestine based on Resolution 242, and therefore on the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, including East Jerusalem. And that allowed us to enter into relationships with countries that were willing to recognize us as a state. And in fact, in that period, in the late 80s, there were more countries that recognized Palestine as a state than there were countries that recognized Israel. So that, just to give you a sense of how international relations work. Of course, we had the observer status at the UN as an observer entity, and in 1998, what we managed to do, again, in 1998, for those of you who are familiar with the Oslo process, we were supposed to have gotten to the point of the final status negotiations with Israel, and we should have had our independent state then. Because of a variety of reasons, this didn't happen, so the Palestinians tried to improve their lot or improve their situation in the international arena and tried to get more rights at the international level. So UN resolution in 1998, resolution 52/250, granted the Palestine observer entity more rights, like rights on getting on the agenda of speakers, being able to raise points or what have you. Some of them are in the documents we send around. So that was another, let's say, group of rights that we managed to secure. What the GA did not do is grant statehood. The GA does not grant statehood, it recognizes. So as far as Palestine is concerned, we achieved statehood by our Declaration of Independence and the international relations we achieved with states that recognize us as such. We tried, as you know, last year to apply for the UN membership, full UN membership through the Security Council, and we didn't manage to get there because we didn't get enough votes on the council. However, that application is still pending. We are still going to go for it when the appropriate time, the Palestinian leadership decides that the appropriate time is there. The important point to say here is that the GA resolution, the one on the non-member state status, because it had 138 countries in favor, and the fact that it's like 93 or 94% of the votes in the General Assembly, that puts pressure on the Security Council to come up with a reason for why Palestine should not be admitted into the UN when so many countries, in fact, an overwhelming majority of countries, even if you look at even the populations, the overwhelming population of the world wants Palestine and recognizes Palestine as a state. So again, that's another place where you see the interface between politics and law. Now, I won't go into the conditions of statehood. You're familiar with the Montevideo Convention. As far as UN capacities, Palestine, again, or when it was the PLO mission, it was the observer mission, observer entity, secured certain memberships, one of which was the being group of the Asian states in the UN, the ECOSOC, or the Economic Social Commission on West Asia, the ESCWA, the Arab League, the Islamic Conference, the Non-Aligned Movement, and the Group of 77 and China. So these groups, the PLO managed to secure membership in those groupings within the UN, even before it got or before getting statehood. But it does not have the right to vote in UN organs, including the General Assembly, and cannot elect or hold positions in those organs. So it cannot sit on the Security Council unless it's invited, or it can also elect the President of the General Assembly, for example. And as far as the UN specialized agencies, there are 16 agencies, specialized agencies in the UN. They're again in the papers we circulated. The application to those agencies vary, the rules for applying to those agencies. But again, what was helpful was the fact that there are different types of groupings of states or formulas for determining whether a country or a member is allowed into an agency. The first of which is being a UN member. When you are a UN member, you can enter into certain states. The other one is if you are a member of a UN specialized agency, and you do not need to be a member of the UN to be a member of the UN specialized agency. And the other if you are party of the ICJ. So in many of those, of those 16 agencies, our capacity to enter into them allows us to enter into others. So for example, the fact that we managed to get into UNESCO, and in that regard, as far as the UNESCO was concerned, our entry into UNESCO was because it was achievable, but also because it helps us protect our archaeological sites, or gives us more tools, that is, to protect our archaeological sites and our historical heritage. So when you look at it, while it's better if we have a complete membership and we automatically get all of these rights, but given that we've been waiting 20 years to achieve statehood and we haven't gotten there, it's difficult for Palestinians to wait another 20 years and have more of their rights practically on the ground swept from under their feet. So our membership in these agencies, even without having full UN membership, is a means to secure some of our rights, even if we can't get all of them. So now that we've entered in the UNESCO, we are able to enter in the World Intellectual Property Organization and the IAEA, the Atomic Energy Agency, because we are already a member of a specialized agency of the UN. So that's an example of how by using some of the tools of the UN, you open the door for others as well. There hasn't been a decision to join those other agencies. The Palestinian leadership has decided to consider entering or study the cost and benefits of entering into those agencies, of course with deliberations and seeking the advice of our allies in the region. Again, as far as international treaties are concerned, the question is whether if we were a full UN member, we would automatically be able to join all of these. But short of that, we're seeking through different formulas, being a member of a special agency, especially an agency, or other means in order to get into some of those treaties. Again, the Palestinian leadership has not decided as of yet, or is still in deliberation on which of these treaties we want to join, and in what at what time. I don't want to take too much time. I want to just give the example of some of the treaties that were being considered. And these are, of course, the Fourth Geneva Convention, the Rome Statute that opens the door for the ICC, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, the Convention Against Torture, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and the International Convention on the Protection of the Rights of Migrant Workers. These are all some of the treaties that Palestine would be able to apply for. It is already eligible, given that it got membership in UNESCO, it's already able to enter with the elimination, with the Convention of the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, as well as the Civil and Political Rights Convention, and the International Convention on the Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So these three, the last three, we are able to enter for the mere fact that we're already a member of a specialized agency, which is UNESCO. Now, as a non-member state at the UN, we still have certain obligations, given the fact that we're a state. Now, these are general obligations of internal security, health, and education, to our, and law and order to our populations, but also in regional and international security, that we have responsibilities with those. Now, let's say the qualification to that is the fact that, despite the fact that we now are a state, our capacity to exercise our obligations and responsibilities are hindered by the facts on the ground, by the fact that, for example, like, yes, we have a president, right, and in theory he's the chief executive, but for that president to move from Ramallah to Bethlehem, he actually requires an Israeli permit, while any Israeli soldier at any time can and does, in fact, enter any Palestinian area, right? Similarly with Gaza, the fact that Gaza is under siege. There is an actuality of occupation. Even if Israel is outside of the boundaries of Gaza, it's still in control of ingress and egress from Gaza, control of the airspace, and control of the water space, and of the crossings. Therefore, as a matter of fact, Israel is in control of those areas. So Palestine's ability to to deliver on those responsibilities of a state are, of course, hindered because of that capacity. This is one of the areas where international law is not fully developed, and therefore provides a lot of gray area for politics to enter. And again, that's an interesting place to study further. One other element to that is that a lot of the conventions, international conventions and treaties, have obligations that are erga omnes in character. That is, that states, third parties, are still required and responsible to make sure that the convention is upheld and respected. So the Fourth Geneva Convention, for example. So even countries outside of Palestine and Israel can intervene and take action with regards to transgressions against the convention, the Fourth Geneva Convention, because the responsibilities in that convention, or the parties, when they committed to that convention, committed to also making sure that other parties uphold the rules and regulations of that convention. Again, just a clarification as far as the issue of representation. Our UN bid does not change the fact that the PLO is the sole representative of the Palestinian people in the international arena. The PLO is, let's say, has the legal personality, again, to engage in negotiations and to speak on behalf or sign treaties on behalf of the Palestinian people. So that does not change. One thing to clarify, because people often confuse that, the difference between the PLO and the PNA. So the PLO is, again, the legal entity that represents Palestinians. The PNA, the Palestinian National Authority, is the administrative body that runs the affairs of Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. So it's an arm of the PLO. It's something that the PLO created through the Oslo process with Israel in order to run the affairs of the Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Therefore, it's a subsidiary to the PLO and not the other way. Because people often talk of the PA and the PLO interchangeably, and that often causes a lot of confusion. So even when PNA officials engage in negotiations, they do so as PLO representatives or as delegated by the PLO. Similarly, PNA ministries and ministers, when they sign treaties or like agreements with other parties like Europeans or on some project, again, they're doing so after being having been delegated by the PLO to engage in those jurisdictions. Having said all of that, both the PLO and the PNA is still, because it's in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, it's still under the power of the Israeli occupation, right? Because Israel is still the occupying power, and when it engaged in the Oslo process with the PLO and created the PA, it did give some jurisdiction as the military occupier. It gave some jurisdiction to the PNA to do certain services or to take on certain activities, but that's through the Israeli occupation allowing that to happen. So the residual power remains with the Israeli occupation. So again, the capacity and the responsibility of the PA within the PNA within the rubric of the occupation is always limited by the Israeli occupation and residual responsibility with Israel. Again, issue of negotiations also. The PLO is the representative that can engage in negotiations. The new status in the General Assembly does not change that. It simply is changed in designation. And of course, the issue of refugees. Again, the refugee issue has several United Nations resolutions, including 194. It's an inalienable right, and nothing changes to that as far as our membership in or our being a state actor. What also another element to that is that there are other non-Palestinian, let's say, instruments that also protect the rights or the issue of the occupation or the issue of the refugees. As we mentioned on the refugees, we have UN resolutions already independent of what the PLO does and the state of Palestine does that protect the refugee issue. As far as the occupation, the ICJ advisory opinion was explicitly saying that the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, including East Jerusalem, are occupied territories, and the Fourth Geneva Convention applies there, as well as annually the General Assembly adopts resolutions on the applicability of the Fourth Geneva Convention on the occupied territories. So, what are the possible, let's say, implications, positive or challenges that Palestinians may face? Of course, the upgrade, as we surveyed before, I'm just going to recap. The upgrade allows us, or not the upgrade, the new status or the new designation allows us to upgrade our diplomatic relations with certain countries that do not recognize us still as a state. We have offices, delegations, or missions. Like here in the United States, we have a delegation, we don't have an embassy. So now the changed designation in the General Assembly, the UN General Assembly, allows us to engage those countries and tell them, well, now we can upgrade our diplomatic mission in your capitals. The fact that Palestine is now further acknowledged as a sovereign territory occupied by another UN, by a UN member state, which is namely Israel, right? So now there is an acknowledgement that the occupation is over a state called Palestine, as opposed to just an issue of occupation without, or where some contend that Israel did not occupy a state. It occupied a territory that was under control of Jordan. The General Assembly resolution puts an end to that debate, because now there is a state called Palestine that is now occupied by a UN member state. Again, as we mentioned, ability to ratify and accede to certain treaties and joining certain special agencies. And also, it will strengthen its ability, Palestine's ability to advocate the Palestinian cause in forums like the ICJ, and if we try the ICC. The challenges, as we mentioned before, is the issue of the theory of being a state and the practice of being a state, and our actual capacity to deliver on those responsibilities. I will stop at that and leave it to Q&A. So thank you for listening.
Well, I first of all want to thank the students for their initiative. Sorry. Yeah. Their initiative in holding the event today, and as usual, I'm very delighted to be able to participate on this. This is a very interesting subject, and I must say that I agree with most things that were said by the previous speaker. Let me start by saying I had occasion in 2008 actually visited Israel as part of a initiative on counterterrorism and human rights project of the International Commission of Jurists, on which I now sit. And we visited with high Israeli authorities in Jerusalem. And then went to Ramallah, where I met with Abu Mazen. And then part of the delegation went down into Gaza. And I also had a tour for about 5 hours by an Israeli human rights organization to go around to the wall and see the effects of what the wall does and so forth. And I must say that I found great difficulties with that particular situation. Let me say at the outset that I am a strong believer in the right of the Palestinian people to have a state. In fact, I believe that they've effectively achieved that, and I'll say why. But with that also comes not only rights of states, but duties of states under international law. The fact that Israel has been occupying territory, and this is the one thing where I differ with the gentleman. There is no question that the West Bank is occupied. And it's not occupied just within the meaning of the Fourth Geneva Convention, but the effective law that defines what an occupation is customary law, and it's found in Article 23 of the Hague Regulations of 1907. And I can tell you right now that Israel is not an occupier of Gaza. Assuming Gaza were an independent state, and that Israel had put on an embargo and did not permit planes to fly, it would be an infraction of their sovereignty. But it does not meet at all the definition. Israel was an occupier of Gaza, but they withdrew. They are not exercising governmental functions whatsoever. They may interfere with certain governmental functions, but it does not meet that definition. So I'm just telling you, it's very fashionable for people to say, oh, well, they're occupying. They are not occupying Gaza, which fundamentally doesn't change things that much in my view. But I don't like political correctness domestically, and I don't like political correctness internationally. Either you meet the definition or you don't meet the definition. And as I said, if Gaza were an independent country and so forth, the actions that Israel was taking would be violations of their sovereignty, most likely, but in no way would it constitute and make them the government effectively, because occupation requires you to invade and to establish a military presence to oust completely the authority that is exercising power, and you begin to exercise all of those powers. Well, to the best of my knowledge, Hamas is doing that, and not the IDF and so forth. So I think we have a difference on that. That said, let's look at the situation and so forth. I think that the Palestinians, rightly out of frustration and so forth, have pursued a policy, and we've just talked about the policy within the United Nations. That there's been this long relationship of a observer status, which has been, quite frankly, changed and upgraded over time with the most recent vote by the General Assembly with 138 countries, as was indicated, to indicate that it is a non-member state. The United Nations does not create states, but it is quite clear that when a state votes for membership in the context in which this occurred, it is acknowledging that the entity really does meet the minimum facts of statehood. That is the important thing. But independent of what happened in the United Nations, is the Palestinians have had a very effective policy since the 1980s of getting recognition. And one has to distinguish between what do we mean by statehood, which is governed, and the creation of states, which are governed under the minimum facts and so forth that are in the Montevideo Convention as customary law, and membership within the United Nations. You can be a state without being a UN member. Switzerland chose not to be a member of the United Nations until 2002. If South Africa or Israel had been expelled at any time, or any other state had been expelled from the United Nations, they would not cease being states merely because they were not members. It does not create a state. What creates a state is an entity that meets minimum facts. The regime that represents it holds itself out to the world as the effective government of the new state, and it is up to every other state to decide whether or not it will accord recognition. Now you have at least 138 states, I think, that have accorded recognition to Palestine as a state. That's significantly more than double that have recognized Kosovo, and so forth. And the fact is, if the United States had not threatened a veto, there is no doubt whatsoever that the votes would have been there, and so forth, within the Security Council, as well as in the General Assembly, that Palestine, and so forth, was a state. Now, what is the significance of the vote in the fact that they did not achieve membership in the outright membership, which would require, for instance, the recommendation of the Security Council and then the vote within the General Assembly? Had that occurred and the United States abstained or voted for it, there would be no question in terms of both the organization and every state who voted that they would be recognizing or acknowledging those minimum facts and that it was a state. And it automatically would have made, for example, Palestine a party to the statute of the International Court of Justice. And it would have made it easier for them to attempt to accede to a variety of treaties or enter organizations. The reality is, however, that the fact is that if they independently of what has been done, and given their widespread recognition, there is a process whereby it can essentially bring cases before the International Court of Justice. If they're thinking about dragging Israel in, forget it, they're not going to be able to do it. Because the ICJ, it would have to have had the consent of Israel in some way, and Israel will never consent to that, quite clearly. And plus, let's face it, they got what they wanted in 2004 in what amounts to be a disguised contentious case against Israel, which was the discussion that dealt with the advisory opinion on the construction of the wall, whereby 14-1, the International Court of Justice found that the wall constituted a violation of the Fourth Convention, and that parts of it had to be taken down, and that Israel should cease and desist from doing it. So effectively, they have used the ICJ for what they really would want to do. The issue really is, and what many people tend to talk about, is the ICC. Now, you cannot confuse the International Court of Justice with the International Criminal Court. The International Criminal Court does not have jurisdiction over states. It just has jurisdiction over individuals, perpetrators or alleged perpetrators of war crimes and crimes against humanity that come within the jurisdiction of the Rome Statute. In 1988, at the time of the Declaration of Statehood and so forth, and with the events, Israel and so forth, the incursion into Gaza, and before it was recognized, their status was only as an organization and not as a non-member state. They filed an application before the International Criminal Court, effectively seeking to have it under Article 12 as sort of a state, and consenting to jurisdiction for purposes that the ICC would investigate effectively what Israel had done, not from the moment of 1988, but retroactively back to the entry into force of the ICC Statute 2002. Rather prudently, the Luis Moreno Ocampo, who was at that time the Argentine, prosecutor, his office came out. They did not reject the application. But quite clearly, you have to satisfy the procedural things, and even though you have to constitute, there's a mechanism that, for instance, if you're not a member of the UN and so forth, you still can be a state and you can consent to jurisdiction with respect to acts that occur within your particular territory, even if it is perpetrated, and those acts are perpetrated by persons who are nationals of states that have not ratified them. And what that particular thing that Luis Moreno Ocampo said is that, look, the status of Palestine is unclear, and we need to await further development and so forth. And now the status, to me, of Palestine is far clearer by the particular vote. So the question is, that you have a new prosecutor also, and it may well be that they will determine that procedurally the issue is before them, in the sense that you do have a state, and that state is invoking Article 12.3. But it's more complicated than that. And because generally treaties have prospective application, they do not relate back in time to events that antedate the entry in force for that particular state. But there is a way whereby you can consent, if you are a proper state and so forth, under Article 12.3, I believe, for them to hear complaints dealing with issues relating back to 2002. I doubt very seriously that that will be the situation. I think this is going to be politically charged enough that they will stick with very prudent ground and say, as of the moment, you, as a matter of fact, I would make them refile, and I'd say you have been determined to be effectively a state and a non-member state, resubmit your application and so forth, and we will take up events that have occurred from that time. That would be the cleanest thing that one could do. It could, on the other hand, they may take, as lawyers, and believe me, you never know what judges sometimes will do, they may take it up the other way. Now, this is something that, of course, has scared the Israelis, the Brits, and a variety of others, and the Americans have expressed their view that they think that this could be counterproductive. And one could say there'd be something a little inelegant where you're going to try to start a negotiation process. At the same time, you're trying to get every prime minister of Israel and every head of the IDF from the period of 2002 onward, getting them indicted as war criminals. I don't think that that would be conducive necessarily to a propitious negotiation. But there's another issue, and be careful at times what you wish for. Because during this same period, their territory was used for the commission of war crimes also. The sending over of suicide bombers started within that territory. The constant launching of missiles that were deliberately indiscriminate and so forth out of Gaza and the like would come also within the jurisdiction, in my view, of the ICC. So, I mean, it's just not going to be, if they do take this, I think it's not just going to focus in. Their territory was used for those purposes and so forth, and that could be done. I think there's no question they're going to be able to, at this point, be able to enter, and I think it'll be useful, into the specialized agencies, the World Bank Group, all of these things that will help, and the like. So effectively, it does change things. Some people say, well, it doesn't change things on the ground. It creates a new dynamic. And I think that is a significant one, and I think it will influence what President Obama and Secretary Kerry will do. I'm somewhat, I must say, encouraged by the most recent developments in Israel. And that the country seems in the last election not to be stop moving so much to the right and so forth, with more of a center coming into the government. And it may be that this is something that will lead to a fruitful negotiation. But just again to conclude, I do feel that Palestine probably does qualify as a state, not just based on the UN thing as peripheral, frankly, based on widespread recognition today by virtually every major region in the world and can claim those rights and duties. So with that, I'll stop. Thank you.
Okay, so I will just give a chance to answer the comments of Professor Goldman to Mr. Nizar, and we will have 5 minutes of questions.
Okay, thank you. I would also agree with what the professor said. I would add to it that the issue of as you said, the ICC is in fact, when we applied in 2009, the response of the ICC was that the ICC is not the authority with the capacity to deliver on what is or is not a state, right? So now that we are a state, that has been answered automatically. And if I understand correctly, the ICC could take the case, or Palestine can accede, right? So there's again a deliberation of what is better, whether it's better to wait for the lawyers and the judges to make a decision on the issue of the question that's still out there as far as Palestine's 2009 question to the ICC, or to go ahead and physically accede to the ICC. That's one. The thing I wanted to also add was the issue of occupation. Again, and Gaza specifically is the issue of the definition of occupation as being one that does not require military presence in all the areas as much as the test of actual control. So, for example, the Israeli army is not in the center of Ramallah, but it still occupies it. So it's not that you don't have to physically be in every single piece of territory. The test is the actual control. Again, the example.
Let me just say, I didn't dispute that. I accept that Israel is an occupier, absolutely, of the West Bank.
Yeah.
What I say is it's not in Gaza.
Yeah. So what I challenge is that Gaza and the West Bank are considered one geographic unit. The ICJ, the highest UN judicial body, said so. So they are one unit. So even if Israel withdraws from parts of the West Bank, it will still be occupied of the West Bank until the issue of actual control over the territory is sorted out. Then Israel remains the occupier. Similarly, with, for example, the issue of the water, the electricity that comes from Israel, like. Regardless of what we think of what's the governing situation in Gaza, effectively there is nothing they can do without Israel controlling it from the outside. So yes, they can control and manage issues within the boundaries of the Gaza Strip, but can the Palestinian leadership, whether in the West Bank or the Gaza Strip, and again as one unit, can they independently take decisions and be able to, as a sovereign, apply and exercise their rights? The answer to that is no, and therefore the occupying power remains Israel. I leave it at that and keep it to questions.
Okay. Yes.
Just follow on to this, because Professor Goldman has raised a very important point. The division between Hamas in Gaza and Fatah in Ramallah is destroying the credibility of our case. Having two governments validate Professor Goldman's point of view that you have two countries because you have two governments. So my question to you is, what are the tangible actions that currently on the ground to bridge this division? And what are these problems for bridging the division?
Okay, that's a very good question. I agree with your point that the internal political situation in Palestine hinders our capacity to deliver, right? That's correct, but that's of less, and this comes to a point that also the professor has raised, which is the actual of international recognition. The PLO remains recognized internationally as the representative, and this remains an international issue now, an internal issue for Palestine as far as internal domestic politics. And classical case is Taiwan, right? Taiwan is not recognized as a state and is recognized as part of China, when effectively they have a government, and so there are similarities of that gray area in international law and in international relations. What's being done on the ground, definitely there is no interest in that division continuing. Both leaderships are trying to bridge the gaps. There are international actors, but mostly regional actors that are trying to help bridge the gaps and let's say soften deals so that the two parties can come along. One basic thing that the PLO has taken as a position is that the PLO is not going to change its charter or change its position vis-a-vis the two-state solution or its previous agreements. If there is going to be, and hopefully there will be going to be reconciliation, is along the terms of the PLO charter and groups like Hamas and Jihad Islami entering the PLO within that rubric. Just to give it an optimistic tone, if we look at the last 10 years as far as those talks between Hamas and because they have been before the split in 2007, and in fact the talks have been since the mid-90s. You do see within groups like Hamas and Jihad Islami, especially after the Arab Spring, a reconsideration of their classical and traditional positions. They're realizing that yes, there is general rhetoric, but when you come and become a power that is responsible for services or seen as such, the equation actually changed. Theory is one thing, practice of governance is something else. So we are seeing signs that within those movements there are dynamics that are pushing for internal discussions over where this is going, what is the actual strategy, and how do we continue to be relevant and representative of what the Palestinian mainstream wants. And in that respect, I would just want to emphasize how, again, the Palestinian mainstream, again, there isn't a majority that's Hamas and a majority that's Fatah. The majority, there are like 20% that's Hamas or Fatah and 30% that's Hamas or Fatah, but the majority in Palestine is always seeking, when it comes to vote for that group that it thinks is going to actually deliver and make a difference. So in 2005, they voted President Abu Mazen because they felt that he can deliver. And he was unable to deliver with the Gaza evacuation, with the worsened situation in Gaza after the Israeli withdrawal, and wasn't able to deliver on the movement and access in the West Bank. So people felt, you know what, if Abu Mazen cannot deliver, a person who has good relations with Israel and the United States, then we will vote for change. And Hamas was very smart and strategic in having the slogan of change, right? So people voted for Hamas not because they sympathize with Hamas, but because they felt that maybe Hamas is going to deliver, again, with the backdrop of Hezbollah's success in South Lebanon, right? So there are these indicators. Similarly now, when with the latest Gaza war on Gaza, and people's experience of the type of governance that Hamas is delivering, you do see like the fact that there were 1 million people in the protest or the demonstration in January on the commemoration of the Fatah commemoration. Of course, there aren't 1 million Fatah members in Gaza. Gaza is 1.5 million, but it's an indication that the majority in Gaza were sending a message to Hamas that no, you do not speak for all of us. A lot of us don't agree with you and do not agree with this politics. So there are a lot of signs in the political entity that's Gaza Strip and the West Bank that are showing the division is slowly moving away, and there's a process of maturation and political evolution within those parties to come together to a unified national strategy.
Thank you. So
you didn't answer the question. I'm sorry, what are the obstacles preventing this from happening?
I'm sorry, we have to wrap up. Thank you very much. I want to thank the speakers. It was a really interesting topic that we can talk about it all day. But we have to continue with the forum. Thank you, all of you.
Thank you.